Clayton Christensen wrote this book called Disrupting Class, where he argued that by 2019, half of all secondary school classes would be taught online, that they would cost a third as much to provision, and they would lead to better learning outcomes in the classes we have now. A few years after that, when edX and Coursera and Udacity were formed at the kind of primordial stage of MOOC mania, Sebastian Thrun said in 50 years, there'll only be 10 institutions in the world delivering higher education, and Udacity might be one of them. Sal Khan published a series of TED Talks, the first in 2011, one of which, Let's Use Video to Reinvent Education. He imagined an educational system where young people spend part of their time sitting in front of computer terminals, having a kind of algorithmically optimized mathematics learning experience. And then teachers would periodically sort of pluck students away from these terminals to do remediation activities or to do projects or other kinds of things like that. But there was this kind of algorithmically driven, optimized learning experience. And then in 2013, in the years around there, Sugata Mitra went even further than all these folks and said, you don't actually need schools. That he had argued that children can organize their own learning, and basically kids with groups of laptops that are connected to the internet can learn anything by themselves. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable claim. Children with access to the internet can learn anything by themselves. My hunch is that any of you who are parents who've had kids at home with laptops over the last 18 months can confirm with real clarity that kids with laptops cannot teach anything by themselves. So we get these visions of technology transformation over 2 decades. A global pandemic occurs. Maybe as many as 1.5, certainly more than 1 billion learners spend some of their time at home, have to figure out how to learn in developed countries through laptops and mobile phones and internet connections, in developing countries through mobile phones, SMS, radio, television, learning at a distance. And to some extent, the stakes of what education technology enthusiasts promised changed. You know, in the years before the pandemic, they said, we can build technologies that will provide an educational system that is substantially better than the existing educational system. During the pandemic, they only had to provide, sort of the education technology enthusiasts only had to provide a new technology-rich environment that was better than our broken, hobbled, closed, emergency pandemic remote system. So in some respects, it was an opportunity for education technology evangelists to ride in on white horses and save the day. And I think, as most of you have experienced, that did not happen. Overwhelmingly, and I've talked to people around the world about this, families found that remote emergency pandemic instruction was somewhere between disappointing and disastrous. There's probably a small group of families and kids who discovered actually that remote or online learning worked particularly well for them. And there's some interesting work to be done to understand those conditions and those students and things like that. But overwhelmingly, it's been a big bummer, and folks have been pretty excited to get back inside schools. Another question we might ask is, when the pandemic occurred and folks switched to remote hybrid forms of learning, what kinds of technologies and what kinds of technology-mediated teaching opportunities did they choose? Did they choose to use massive open online courses, or intelligent tutors, or artificial intelligence, or virtual reality? Was this students' sort of first stepping stones into Facebook's new metaverse? My understanding is no. My understanding is that when schools around the world chose the technologies that they wanted to use during the pandemic, they actually chose two of our very oldest sets of technologies. One of those technologies was a learning management system. Learning management systems are platforms that allow teachers to assign work to students and students to submit that work for collection. In my elementary school daughter's backpack, she has a folder, and on one side it says to home, and on one side it says to school. And she brings documents back and forth to school that way physically. And learning management systems are basically a digital version of that. They were theorized in the 1960s and 1970s. They were commercialized in the 1990s. They were made open source in the 2000s, one of our oldest and most familiar forms of technology. And then the second tool that dominated the pandemic was when it was introduced in the 1930s, it was called video telephony. We're approaching a century of development, research, design with video conferencing. If you describe video conferencing in sort of abstract terms, it sounds like something that would be pretty useful for remote teaching. You know, like nominally speaking, there can be a speaker who shares their face and their voice and their computer screen, and other people can see not only the speaker's voice and face and computer screen, but the voice and face of other people listening as well. That kind of sounds sort of like what happens in a classroom, but as any of you who are teachers know, teaching through Zoom is a little bit like teaching through a keyhole. With some awkward straining, you can kind of see and hear what's happening on the other side, but it's not really conducive to meaningful conversation. And then, you know, what did schools around the world do with these two tools? A paradox of the pandemic is that teachers put in extraordinary efforts, incredibly long hours, a real sacrifice, a private sacrifice for the public good by teachers around the world. But overwhelmingly, they use these technologies to reproduce the existing educational system online. If students took 7 classes in middle school in person, we had them set up 7 classes online, each with a synchronous Zoom session. There were a few places around the world that experimented with some different models. If you had asked instructional designers familiar with online learning before the pandemic, what kinds of strategies we should use to do online teaching and learning, the answer would not have been to reproduce schools as they exist. But the patterns that we see during the pandemic fit, I think, 2 of the most important lessons from the history of education technology. If you go back, and the history of digital education technology is long. We're really, you know, past the half-century mark at this point. From the earliest days when we had computers that were the size of your living room, computer scientists, cognitive scientists, educators have partnered to build technologies that help people teach and learn. So this is not a new thing. We've worked on this for a long time. We have a lot of history around it, and 2 findings emerge over and over again. When teachers get access to new technologies, they use them to extend existing systems and practices. If you take a whole bunch of technology and you throw it at schools, the thing that you should expect more than anything else is they will use that technology, whatever its affordances are, whatever its potential benefits are, to do whatever it is they were doing before. It's not because teachers are lazy. It's not because teachers are slow. It's because educational systems are immensely complex. They balance a really delicate, intertwined set of goals. We use schools to teach kids how to tie their shoes, how to factor polynomials, how to conjugate Spanish verbs, how to read Russian poetry and plays, how to be patriotic citizens, how to critique their government, how not to engage in sexual encounters, but if they do engage in sexual encounters, how to do it safely. There's a lot that we ask schools to do. They're complex places. And so it is not obvious to educators how to take new technologies and to use them to do really different kinds of things. It's sort of enough of a challenge to get them to do what they were doing before. And then the second finding that we see over and over again in the history of education technology is that where there is beneficial and innovative new practices, it tends to disproportionately benefit affluent folks with the financial, social, technical capital to take advantage of new innovations. We should, generally speaking, not expect new technologies to democratize education. Moving all of learning online or into hybrid environments did not close achievement and opportunity gaps. It dramatically exacerbated them, as we should expect. So throughout failure to disrupt, these are just two of the core findings that we see over and over again that we can use as guideposts to thinking about the future. They can also help inform the kinds of stances that we take towards change. And to illustrate this, I'll talk about one of the education technology enthusiasts who I mentioned, who I think has talked, at least somewhat in recent years, very differently than he did 10 years ago. And that's Sal Khan of Khan Academy. So millions of people have watched one of Sal Khan's TED Talks. Far fewer people have read his 2019 interview in District Administration Magazine. District Administration Magazine is a little trade journal for head teachers, school superintendents. In between founding Khan Academy in 2019, Sal Khan had also created a school called the Khan Lab School. And the idea was this was, as a private school in the Bay Area, I think cost $25,000, $30,000 a year to attend. And the idea was for it to be a demonstration school like John Dewey had in Chicago a century before, to demonstrate new ideas, his ideas, to bring his vision to life. And in this 2019 interview, he says, now that I run a school, I see that some of the stuff is not as easy to accomplish compared to how it sounds theoretically. More recently, we're seeing that if students put 30 minutes to an hour per week, one class period a week towards software-based, self-paced practice problems, schools will see a benefit of that. And that's exciting because that's really doable. So, in 2011, Sal Khan is talking about using video to reinvent education. He works on that for about 8 years. And then he says, actually, you know what? Maybe just one day a week of practice problems would be a good improvement. When I read this interview, it reminded me very much of work that had been done nearly 3 decades earlier. So this is my colleague, Ken Kadinger at CMU, and some of his colleagues. Intelligent tutoring goes to school in the big city, where they basically did in the early 1990s what Sal Khan was proposing in 2019. They got a bunch of computer tutors. They brought them into schools. They tried to get teachers to sort of teach their regular classes 3 days a week and do online practice or digital practice problems 2 days a week. They couldn't get the teachers to do it 2 days a week. They mostly did it 1 day a week, but it still kind of helped. One of the ways that you could frame this insight is that after 10 years and $150 million of philanthropic investment, Sal Khan discovered what could have been figured out with a trip to the library. That we've known for a long time that computers potentially have a role to play in helping students learn math as a supplementary role rather than a transformative role. Another way to frame some of this is to say there's really kind of 2 stances that we could take towards education technology in the future. one of which is, and I take these two stances from a great book by Morgan Ames called The Charisma Machine, about the one laptop per child program. And in this book, Morgan lays out these two potential stances towards education technology. One she calls the charismatic stance. This is kind of Sal Khan circa 2011, where technology has this power to disrupt and transform existing systems. And the future will be brand new and different because of new technology. Another potential stance she characterizes as the tinkering stance, drawing from this book by David Tyack and Larry Cuban, Tinkering Towards Utopia. And this is what Sal Khan in 2019 sounds more like. And in this model, existing systems domesticate new technologies. New technologies don't disrupt and transform systems. Existing systems take new technologies and go, you fit here. You work for these particular students in these particular contexts for these particular learning areas. And if you believe that, then really the future is an extension of trends from history. That doesn't mean that you can't make the future better, but it means the future looks much more like a process of continuous improvement. 2 steps back for every 3 steps forward, a real shoulder to the wheel, incremental kind of approach, rather than imagining new technologies that'll sweep everything away and do something different. That can be disappointing. You know, if you're a technologist who's watched Moore's Law for the last 40 years and seen us, you know, fit a doubling of transistors onto silicon chips every 18 months, and all the changes in society that have followed from that, that might be disappointing. But our schools, the institutions that we use to help young people become adults, they're not transistors. You can't double them every 18 months. You can make them better, but making them better is a process of continuous improvement. So I think there are 2 big mistakes that technology evangelists made during the pandemic. It was arguing that learning technologies are all purpose when they're actually like quite distinct. You know, it's almost like the education system is like a field of differently shaped bolt heads. And our technologies are like little ratchets. And when we build a technology that can tighten down one bolt, maybe it can tighten down a couple of other bolts that are the same size, the same shape, the same depth or whatever. But then there's just a whole bunch of other bolts that are really different, that the technology we've just built for math just doesn't help us that much in the social studies or in language learning. And then the other piece that folks consistently miss about learning technologies is people keep hoping that they're like a switch that you can flip on, that you can just download new technologies onto students' machines and learning will be different. But new learning technologies are only as powerful as the communities that support their use. Another way, I came up with this after the book. Maybe I'll put it in the second edition, but you know, every technology solution is a human capital problem. Every time you come up with some technology-mediated way to solve an issue, you then have to help in the education sector, students and parents and school leaders and teachers figure out new routines, new practices, new pedagogies for integrating these new technologies. Even if you can download things on students' machines really fast, those other kinds of changes are really slow. So if you do want to engage in this kind of process of continuous improvement, what might that look like? And I'd argue, you know, my colleagues at CMU like to describe folks who are trying to bring about better futures for education using learning technologies as learning engineers, as engineers who combine some familiarity with computer science with familiarity with learning science. And sort of learning engineering is kind of at the junction of those 2 fields. I think there are lots of fields that can contribute to better teaching and learning in schools. And I think one of them that's quite useful is history. I think one of the most powerful questions that people in schools can ask when they're confronted with a new learning technology is what's new. Every education technology entrepreneur is going to present you with MOOCs, with AI, with video conferencing, with data science as this brand new, shiny new vehicle that's just showed up on the lot for the first time. But educators should remember that we've been working on these problems for decades. And it's sort of like when you pop open the hood of a shiny new car and you go, oh, that's the same chassis that we've been using for decades. That's the same internal combustion engine that we've been looking at for decades. And if you can identify how a new entrant is actually connected, is a descendant of past kinds of technologies, then you can make some good guesses about how a new thing will operate in existing schools. One particularly useful question that I've found to ask is, who guides the sequence of learning activities in a learning environment? I propose this idea that there's sort of 3 genres of learning at scale. One of those genres is instructor-guided learning at scale, where an expert puts together a sequence of learning experiences, and learners, for the most part, proceed through those learning activities as they were set out by the expert. That's things like massive open online courses and other self-paced online learning experiences. A second genre is one where an algorithm sets the sequence of learning experiences, where a computer gives students some kind of problem, the students submit a response to the problem, and then if the student is successful, the algorithm gives them a harder problem or a new content area. If the student struggles with the problem, they give them remediation or easier problems or other opportunities to practice. And then a third model is peer-guided learning at scale. This might be things like the Scratch programming community or the original Canadian connectivist MOOCs, if people are familiar with those, where the learning sequence is set out by a group of peers, that there's not one expert sort of dictating a pathway through learning experiences, but they're collaboratively developed by groups of peers. And actually, almost all of you probably participate informally in some of these peer-guided learning communities. If you have hobbies like knitting or sewing or crafts, or if you want to learn how to be a computer programmer, or if you want to learn how to, fix your snow thrower or unclog your toilet, almost all people participate in these kinds of informal networks of peer learning environments. It turns out they're very difficult to implement in the constraints of schools. So there are these 3 genres, and we can figure out some things about these genres. So for instance, to a first approximation, there's basically 2 ways of teaching people. You either have experts tell novices stuff, or you have experts set up novices to practice trying to do things on their own. There's all kinds of hybridization and variations of that, but that's basically 2 ideas. In the United States, we had these 2 fellows in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the 1900s, Edward Thorndike and John Dewey, and they kind of represented these 2 poles. But 2,000 years ago, Plutarch made the argument that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a flame. And that basically sets up the duality of, some people think that education is pail filling, and some people think it's flame kindling. And these pedagogies map typically onto technologies. So for instance, instructor-guided learning at scale tends to be built from 2 kinds of repeated technologies: learning management systems with some kind of auto grader associated with it. And they tend to have this sort of instructionist, direct instruction kind of approach. The algorithm-guided learning at scale, almost all of these systems still use some variant of a statistical toolkit called item response theory. And item response theory is basically a way of creating a mathematical model of how difficult an item is in a content area, to be able to quantify, is this an easy question or a hard question? And if you can do that quantification, then you can have algorithms that sort of assign the problems of the right level of difficulty or a desired level of difficulty to different students. Again, in this kind of instructionist mode. Peer-guided learning at scale tends to use different technologies. They tend to be built on the World Wide Web, and they tend to be focused on aggregators, on bringing together, less about auto-grading people and more about connecting them with each other. And they tend to be more sort of apprentice-oriented. So if these are the three genres, we have pretty good research in each of these three genres about where they work and where they don't. It's hard to summarize because it's quite granular. For instance, in sort of self-paced learning, that tends to work, instructor-guided learning at scale. It tends to work pretty well with people who are already educated and already affluent. If you've had a really good apprenticeship in the formal education system, you might be pretty good at learning on your own, although many people find this really difficult. Any of you who have tried to do self-paced courses during the pandemic know this. And so, massive open online courses, MOOCs, they prove to be pretty good for people earning their second master's degree. They prove to be much less useful, expanding new opportunities for people to make their way into higher education. Algorithm guided learning at scale, it works pretty well, or it has the potential to work pretty well in subject areas in which computers can sort of wrestle with what the right answer is. It works pretty well in math. It works pretty well in computer science. It works pretty well in early language acquisition, but not in later language acquisition. We can, Duolingo has pretty good algorithm guided learning at scale for helping you learn to conjugate Spanish verbs. It has much less resources to offer you in trying to come up with sensible interpretations of Don Quixote. And then peer-guided learning at scale, you might describe it as more spiky. There are some students and learners that really latch on to particular communities and particular learning experiences. They have very, very deep, meaningful experiences, but it tends not to work well for everyone. And it tends not, a lot of people get confused and lost in these peer-guided learning environments because we need the support of educators. That's why we have teachers. And peer-guided learning tends not to work super well in schools, where there's so much emphasis on individual evaluation, individual performance. So if you're a department head of a school, if you're an associate provost for technology at a college, one of the things that Failure to Disrupt tries to do is to look at the landscape of education technology, to break it down into a few genres and to say, we know something about each of these genres. And as you're confronted with new technologies, new choices, you should be able to look at them and say, okay, that fits into one of these three kinds of categories. We can figure out what the research says about how well these things do. And then we can figure out whether or not that research suggests that this new tool is going to be productive and useful in our schools or not. It's Failure to Disrupt at the beginning offers kind of a blueprint of looking to the past to figure out how new technologies might support learners in the future, recognizing and arguing for a great deal of continuity between the past and the future. And of course, we want these technologies to be continually improving and getting better. And so that means confronting, when technologies don't prove to be transformative, what are the barriers towards having them be more effective? And three key features of schools that I think I've already alluded to, features of schools and technologies. Schools are complex institutions that are constantly weighing multiple conflicting mandates and priorities. Our technologies are uneven. They are useful for some learners in some subject areas, in some contexts, but not others. And then both our schools and our technologies are inequitable. And a fundamental feature in many parts of the world of the landscape of our schools is that the kinds of things that might disproportionately benefit marginalized students are not the same kinds of things that would benefit students with lots and lots of resources. So in the second half of Failure to Disrupt, I argue that there are four as yet intractable dilemmas. Four problems that education technology designers and their partners in schools should be thinking about tackling. And in part, these are ways of explaining why new technologies don't disrupt schools, why they get domesticated. So I'll mention each of them briefly, and then we can have time for a conversation. But But one of these challenges is the curse of the familiar. And the curse of the familiar is the idea that if you want a new technology to be adopted by schools, because teachers extend existing technologies, the best way to get rapid, widespread adoption in schools is to digitize some kind of existing practice. One of the most widely used technologies in the world is for education is called Quizlet, and Quizlet makes digital flashcards. As soon as you see Quizlet, you'll recognize it as a flashcard app. You know, you put questions on one side, answers on the other, terms on one side, definitions on the other. If we brought together the world's educational experts and say, what do schools really need from technology to move teaching and learning forward? There's no one who would raise their hand and say, we really have to tackle this issue of flashcards. There's just not enough flashcards in schools and not enough access to flashcards in schools. Like, this is a thing that we really need digital help with. When you digitize existing practices, you can get widespread adoption, but you tend not to get that much learning change. Because if you just have people digitally do the same kinds of things that they were doing before, that doesn't necessarily lead to better results. Now, the flip side of this problem is if you build something really new and really exciting and really different, no one's going to know what to do with it. And schools tend to reject those really innovative new technologies that might lead teachers and students in different directions. If there is a solution to the curse of the familiar, it probably looks something like building technologies that look familiar on the front end, but become something really different in the future. There are ways of simplifying people's entry point into the Scratch programming language. So it looks like a simple way of teaching some basic features of coding, of computer programming, but it can actually be a really powerful tool for exploring computational creativity. There's a piece of math software called Desmos, which when you first encounter it, looks an awful lot like a graphing calculator, like the Texas Instruments 84 in the United States that you might have seen in your pre-calculus class. And it can do that. It can replace an existing piece of technology, but there's much, much more it can do to help students explore mathematical modeling and graphical representations of mathematics. So that's one pathway through the curse of the familiar. I've mentioned a couple of times the second issue, what I call the EdTech Matthew effect, which is that we keep hoping that new technologies disproportionately will benefit marginalized, low income, poor learners. And that is very, very rarely what we see in practice. Overwhelming what we see is that new technologies disproportionately benefit the affluent. Maybe they help everyone, but they actually lead to expanding gaps between wealthy and less wealthy students. And so a substantial challenge for designers to try to figure out, like, what are the projects out there? What are the tools and approaches that really disproportionately benefit the students who might most need our help and would close rather than exacerbate these gaps? A third challenge that particularly bedevils instructor-guided learning at scale and algorithm-guided learning at scale, I call the trap of routine assessment. I mentioned before that computers are good at assessing the kinds of things that computers can already do. So when problems are routine, when they're structured, when they're well-defined, computers are good at assessing human performance on those things. Unfortunately, what we need human beings to be able to do in the future are the things that computers can't do. For instance, one of the most important things we teach from kindergarten through graduate school is reasoning from evidence. Typically in unstructured text, in oral presentations, computers are really bad at evaluating people's proficiency with reasoning from evidence, even though it's kind of the most important thing that we teach. So we have these technologies that essentially are good at assessing human performance at things that we don't need human beings to do anymore. And we don't have good technologies for evaluating the kinds of things that we really need them to be able to do. And this sort of shapes, and I would argue kind of perverts, education technology development in all kinds of ways. And then the final challenge I call the toxic power of data and experiments, which is that a really neat thing, if you're a researcher like me, about online learning platforms is that they collect all kinds of data about what people do on those platforms. It's really easy to assign different people to have different learning experiences. When you go on to websites like Facebook or Amazon, 1% of the time that you show up on those sites, they're presenting you a slightly different version of the site. They make the blue button a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. They make it blue instead of red. And then they measure with each of those little experiments how to get people to buy more stuff. And that's why those technologies improve so rapidly over time, because they're constantly being experimented with and tested on. People are being experimented with and tested on. Now, if you're a learning scientist like me, the phrase conduct experiments on children sounds pretty good, because it's through experiments that we develop new knowledge and can improve systems. There are lots of folks, however, in the public, parents and privacy advocates and others, who don't think that conducting experiments on children is such a great idea. And I think there are very legitimate concerns with developing education technologies that track and watch everything that kids and teachers do, and having that be a way of inducting young people into a surveillance society that ultimately ends up curtailing our freedoms, even while it provides some opportunities to learn more about how people learn. So there are really challenging moral and ethical dilemmas that are baked into these systems that are not easy to resolve. So in the second half of Failure to Disrupt, I described these 4 kinds of challenges as ones that if we want the field of education technology to move forward, if we want to be able to tinker better in the future over time, these are some of the places where disruptive transformational efforts get stuck over and over again. And we might find pathways through design, through implementation, through research to other kinds of futures. But really the heart of Failure to Disrupt, it's got a kind of downer title, but there is an optimistic message in it, which is that we can make schools better, but we're not going to make schools better through sweeping kinds of disruptive changes. We're going to make schools better through a process of continuous improvement. Technology is going to help that process of continuous improvement, but it's not going to be that process of continuous improvement. What's going to make our schools are only as good, our technologies are only as good as the communities of practice who support their use. If we want better schools, it means creating the conditions for teachers, for educators, for parents to be able to support students better. There's a role for technology in doing that hard work of continuous improvement. But if we don't understand, what the challenges look like and what the most productive paths forward are, then we're not going to be as effective as we can as marching towards that continuous improvement. So that's a little bit of a story of how education technology has developed over the last 40 years, how we steered through the pandemic, and what some of the future might look like. And so with that, I'll pause sharing my screen for a bit and invite Tenzin to help facilitate a Q&A. So my understanding is folks are free to put some questions in the chat for people to facilitate, but I'll let Tenzin describe to us our marching orders from here.
Well, there are no marching orders. Just put in the questions in chat and we will get to it. Justin, thank you again for the insightful presentation. Maybe I can start with at least some questions. I mean, one thing with techno-utopia is all the promises that it makes in terms of what it is going to deliver. And, you brought up 1 laptop per child and a couple of other experiments. In your research, do you find that it's only failure to deliver on certain kinds of promises, as in not meeting the mark, or has certain kinds of tech-led disruptions actually damaged systems of education? Or is it simple? It's just failure to deliver versus actual damage?
I think that's a great question. I mean, one of the challenges to that is that a lot of the costs of education technology implementations are opportunity costs. You spent X million dollars on one thing, and you could have spent them on something else. So I teach classes at MIT called things like learning media and technology. And one of the questions I always ask the incoming students is to describe what are some of the most memorable technology implementations that they experienced as learners in schools growing up. And we're just now hitting a group that I call the smartboard generation. So in middle schools across the United States, about 8 to 10 years ago, schools spent millions of dollars replacing the whiteboards or chalkboards on their wall with these digital smartboards. And pretty much universally, people describe this as a waste of funds, that these things did not improve teaching and learning, that they were basically just used like the whiteboards before. It didn't really make any sense why these were going to be transformative or particularly helpful, but somehow they were sort of symbols of the future. Though that funding could have been spent on helping teachers get better at formative assessments, on helping doing restorative justice practices to keep more kids in schools and all kinds of other things. I think some of my colleagues would make stronger arguments about the harms of education technology. When education technology and higher education is yoked to kind of for-profit market reforms, when it's yoked to effort to push people into expensive degrees that have no real value, that you sort of couldn't offer these scams on-campus programs because it's like too expensive to build the infrastructure to bring people on campus for degrees that are not worth their time. But you can much more rapidly generate those things. My colleague Tressie McMillan-Cottom has written a book called Lower Ed, that describes some of these harms, and I think those are yoked to online learning. But it's also like it's the predatory practices behind them probably more to blame than the education technology. But in the section on the toxic power of data and experiments, one of the things I say is, in some respects, it's a cost-benefit analysis to think about how you would implement, or a cost-risk analysis to think about how you would implement new technologies, and it's hard to say. There's not dispositive evidence that lots of new technology efforts are much better for learning, but there's also not, huge evidence that lots and lots of harms, that children are worse off after these kinds of interventions. And so it's a tough place to make decisions.
Yeah, no, it's a very insightful point about, as such, education as a field is suffering from lack of resources in terms of how teachers and educators get paid, but putting $100 million in wrong places might not be the useful thing. The other question I had was, one of the, so to speak, attractiveness of certain kinds of technologies like Khan Academy and others is the scale of things. And they would always sort of make this argument. And in fact, even people, philanthropists who are funding education, oftentimes ask this question of scale. What in your mind at this moment is sort of this balancing act between the breadth of education versus the depth of education? That yes, we have algorithms to evaluate kids and their learning on certain online platforms, but should scale be as attractive of a proposition in education?
I think the way that I try to frame the problem is technology only useful when incorporated into systems change and the development of people using it. That explains why technology changes at scale don't lead to the outcomes we want in some respect. It is true that you can fairly trivially get, say, millions of kids across the country to occasionally watch Khan Academy videos or do practice problems. But watching Khan Academy videos is not that much better than listening to their teacher or reading the textbook. And doing those practice problems is not that much better than doing the practice problems in the back of their textbook. What's really hard is getting people to take advantage of the technology to create more kinds of personalized pathways, or the sort of competency-based models that Khan sort of promises are really the payoff of the new technology. And it's because downloading the Khan Academy app doesn't get you that systems change. You can have, we can have kids in all 130,000 schools across the US download the Khan Academy app, and that's not that hard. But you really have to work with schools one at a time to get them to think about that kinds of systems change. So there's like part of the equation which you can address through scale, but that human-centered part of the equation is really still sort of one at a time. A couple of years ago, Bill Gates gave a talk sort of reflecting on the Gates Foundation over multiple years. And he said something like, when we started this work, we thought fixing schools and making them get better would be easy. And we thought public health would be really hard. And it turns out that we've made much more progress in public health and much less progress in schools. And it's because like malarial parasites are actually pretty simple organisms. And you can find ways to address them in relatively simple ways. And schools and people's learning is just immensely complex. That complexity is masked by the fact that it's not that hard for a novice teacher to go pick up a textbook and read it in front of a group of students and kind of have them do that in an okay kind of way. But really making schools better is just immensely complex and difficult and worthy of our attention and care and investment.
Thank you. I'll combine this question from Rachel and Yvonne. Do you think there is any chance for technology to facilitate movement towards more personally meaningful, playful, child-driven learning, along with sort of any technologies that you see on horizon that you're excited about?
Yeah, those are great questions. It's useful to make a distinction between what we do outside of schools and what we do inside of schools. Outside of schools, learning has been profoundly transformed by digital tools. Much of our leisure time is now spent, I opened the book with this anecdote of this craft toy called Rainbow Loom. It's basically a way of like using rubber bands to make bracelets. And when there are newspaper articles about it, when it first came out, there are all these stories about like, oh man, finally we got kids off their phones and they're playing with this crafty toy right now. But actually Rainbow Loom is not fun without your phone. You can only make like the first couple of simple bracelets before you run out of things to do. And then you need to learn more about it. And no local community has enough expertise to help people develop mastery in Rainbow Loom. And so you go watch videos and you post your creations online and you get into networks and things like that. So it sort of already has done that personally meaningful, playful, child-driven learning. And then when that stuff arrives in schools, there's just all kinds of structures and expectations that we put on schools that make that much less feasible. We want students in schools to make progress towards standards-aligned curricula goal, towards a core knowledge that we as a society believe is important. And I might question some of those decisions, but there's actually good reasons behind a bunch of that. And so it's not going to be technology might open the door for some of those things to happen, but if people want more personally meaningful, playful, child-driven learning, it will come through organizing. The way we make change in complex systems is through politics and organizing. In the case of education, it's not through technology.
A question from William Roberts. From a student perspective, what is the overhead cost of learning to use the technology versus learning the knowledge/information which the technology is intended to teach?
I think that's an important consideration, and certainly one that we witnessed vividly during the pandemic. In April and May of 2020, teachers sent their kids home. A kid had 7 different teachers in middle school, and each teacher gave them 3 different apps that they wanted to use. And all of a sudden parents had 21 different passwords and 21 different logins, and it was a disaster. And most schools said, nope, we're not doing that in September of 2020. And they settled on a more narrow set of tools. I mean, that's a little bit of the explanation of why did everybody end up with learning management systems and video conferencing? Well, one reason is it's just hard to teach people how to use a lot of other things. In a well-designed educational system, you would continue to build students' proficiency with technology-mediated learning over a sequence of grades. Like if we were good at coordinating how people learn from 3rd grade to 6th grade to 9th grade to 12th grade, you would sort of like amortize those overhead costs of learning over multiple subjects over 12 years. But that's hard coordination work to do, especially as the technology is changing, kids move around and things like that. But I think really good school systems do think about how they manage that overhead cost of learning and make sure that if you have to do things that teach people how to learn in a particular way, that there's a payoff that emerges from that.
Another question I had, Justin, is you mentioned some of these systems, tech assisted system, kind of an on-ramp for learning, and you mentioned that, for certain kind of quantitative learning, it's probably better suited, like math or computer programming and so on. But for others, like language learning and so on, you get to a certain stage, and then you're kind of on your own in some way. But overall, what's your understanding at the moment in terms of are there technologies that are designed that are better suited for liberal arts education, or is it encouraging a lack of interest in liberal arts education because using tech tools and these kinds of platforms is more attractive for young mind, and so if I can't study philosophy or history through computers, I'm not interested in it?
I think it's far more likely that there are structural factors rather than the specific technologies that are driving that, because we, it's never hard to find demonstrations of really interesting implementations of these things. When MOOCs first came out, some of the earliest ones to get attention were CS50 and 6001, the computer science classes. But people pointed out that there was a decade of experimentation with this class that was affectionately called ModPo, was modern poetry. And there are all kinds of cool ways to bring people online to study poetry, to read poetry together, to annotate each other's poetry. One of the things that young people are incredibly interested in and invested in is the practice of fan fiction, of taking stories that are commercially published and creating side narratives or reinterpretations. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of kids who are writing millions and billions of words of fan fiction in a way that they never had before because they're networked with each other. That's really powerful liberal arts learning that's happening right there. It's a great example of remixing and reinterpretation of annotation. So technologies can do all of these kinds of things, whether or not but they can't be mixed together in all kinds of possible ways. We still don't have a tool that can read a kid's fan fiction and sort of automatically say these parts are good and these parts are less good. We can spell check it, and as long as that's the case, then there's going to be limits to the kind of scale of really meaningful feedback than folks can get from a computer, from an entirely self-paced computer-contained system than others. But folks in the liberal arts, I think, should not be afraid of new technology. I mean, as we've certainly learned in the last 2 years, like there will always be places to turn this stuff off and to be really connected with one another. But as this event demonstrates, it's also really powerful to bring people around the world and to use the technologies for what it does best.
Great. One last question, Justin. I know you have to rush off as well, but one last question. You alluded to this idea of in my words, a resistance to changing the existing culture. Like education in some ways is also one of the least innovative systems. The way we have lectured for past 200 years, if not longer, and so on. What are some of the elements that you would identify that would help educators and systems to create or foster at least more resilient culture that might help better adaptation and design of technology?
Yeah, it will always be hard, because it should not surprise us that people are conservative about how children are raised. That seems like a pretty normal thing in society, to be a place that we don't want to have a lot of crazy experimentation going on. And also the demands that we put on school systems are complex. I mean, part of the reason why I'm interested in technology is that I do think it can be a powerful catalyst for sparking those conversations. When there are, all around the university, people are rethinking how they do teaching and learning because folks were forced to use technology in different ways over the last 2 years. And there's lots of places where people are saying, oh, let's put that back on the shelf and get rid of it. But there are also lots of places where people are saying, oh, we should be rethinking how we do these things. I think the climate crisis is going to force a reckoning in schools. The interruptions that we experienced over the last year and a half are going to be more common in the future. There's going to be more floods, more fires, more freezing events, more disease events. Schools need to become more resilient to closing. In the United States, in lots of places, both the surge of interest in anti-Black racism that was connected to the George Floyd protests, as well as the sort of reactionary surge of anti-critical race theory. Those are also going to be, mechanisms by which we engage folks in schools. For people who are school people, the key, part of the first order challenge is like getting better at getting better. And getting better together. We have lots of teachers that are good at making their own instruction in their own classroom better, and then they retire or leave, and that wisdom doesn't get translated. What the very best schools in the country and the world do is they learn together. They take joy in getting better together. And that's really the secret to this kind of cultural change or continuous improvement. You have to have a group of people that want to get better together.
Great. On that note, Justin, thank you so very much again for joining us this morning. And folks, if you're interested, next week, same time, we'll have Jenna Bednar from University of Michigan to discuss governance for human social flourishing. Justin, thank you very much, and everyone have a lovely day or have a good night.
Thanks, Tenzin. It was wonderful to be here. Thanks to the translators and everybody else.
Thank you.